The carpenter's rule is to measure twice and cut once. And so when implementing our manual NAT, let's have a game plan. Let's do this. Let's set up a manual NAT rule on firewall 1 that says any traffic that's coming in to the IP address of 67.83.0.111, which is the firewall 1's E1 interface address, and if it's coming in on TCP port 80, let's go ahead and do destination NAT and translate that to the IP address of 192.168.1.100, which translates to the IP address of the web server behind the firewall. Let's also configure on this web server AutoNAT so that when it replies out, the firewall will hide its real IP address. So that'll give us an example of a manual rule for the inbound traffic and an auto rule for the outbound traffic. And then we'll also set up access control with permissions that allow TCP on port 80 to go ahead and be accepted. And that's the permissions part of the show, so that a user out here on the internet can go ahead and access that web server. So we'll start off here on Client NUG. We've launched Smart Console, supplied the password, and clicked Login. From here, let's click on Security Policies over here on the left. And then under Access Control, we'll click on NAT. And let's create a new rule above our AutoNAT rules. So we'll right-click on the very top section here for the top automatic generated rules. Right-click there. And from here, select New Rule, and we'll click on Above. For the source, it could be anywhere on the internet, so we're going to leave that alone. For the destination, we're going to specify the outside interface of Firewall 1, which is 67.83.0.111. So we'll either grab or select an object for that, or we'll create one. So we'll click on the plus symbol here for original destination. One way of looking for an existing object with that IP address is to search for it. So here in the search field, let's put in 67.83.0.111, and it comes up empty. Wah, wah, wah. That's okay. We'll click on the little icon for new, and then from the drop down, we'll select host, and we'll create a new host object, and we'll call it firewall-1 space outside space IP, and then we'll put in that IP address, which is 67.83.0.111, just like that, and click OK. So now we have that as the original destination. And regarding the service, the original destination port, we're going to match this NAT rule on any incoming traffic that is specifically going to TCP port 80, the well-known port for HTTP. So we'll click on the plus symbol for original services. We'll use the search and type in HTTP. And then from the options, we'll go ahead and double-click on HTTP to add that in the original services column. Then moving on to translated source, the original source IP address of our customer coming in from the internet, we're going to leave that alone. But what we are going to do is we are going to translate the destination address. So the destination address we want to have is the IP address of our web server. So we'll click on the plus symbol to grab an object that represents the web server, and we can search again for 192.168.1.100. And I don't have an object for the web server, so we'll go ahead and create one as well. We'll just click on the icon for new, and then from the drop down, select host. And then we'll call this web server real IP and put in the real IP address of our web server, which is 192.168.1.100. And while we're at it, because we're right here looking at the object, we could very easily over here on the left-hand side click on NAT and tell it for outbound traffic from this web server to go ahead and do AutoNAT with hiding the IP address of this web server behind the IP address of the firewall. So with NAT selected on the left, we'll click on the checkbox and put a check there for Add Automatic Address Translation Rules. We're going to go ahead and use Hide, and we only really need to apply this to Firewall 1. So with all that in place, we'll click on OK. And notice this, it's placed it here for us, but it also created the AutoNAT rule right here in this AutoNAT section as well. So if we expand that, this rule number 1 would be used for incoming traffic going to TCP port 80 at the outside address of the firewall, which would then be destination NATed over to the web server address. And then for the reply traffic, the outbound traffic from the web server, we're going to hide its real IP address behind the firewall's address. And that would be for traffic that is sourced by the web server going out through the firewall. So our network address translation rules are set. However, we also need to make sure we have permissions for that external traffic to be accepted at the firewall for TCP port 80. So to do that, under Access Control, we'll click on Policy. And I'm going to insert a rule at the very top, so it's easy to find. We know what the number is. We'll right-click on this top section, and we'll say New Rule, and we'll click on Above. So this will be new rule number 1. We'll call it to web server. The source could be anywhere. The destination is going to be the outside interface address of firewall 1, which is 67.83.0.111. So we'll click on the plus symbol, and because here we have an object that represents that IP address, we'll go ahead and double click on firewall 1 outside IP as an object. Let me make that a little bit bigger so we can see it. And then for services and applications, we don't want to allow just everything. We want to specify HTTP. So we'll click on the plus symbol in the service and applications column. We'll use the search tool for HTTP to refine the list, and then double click on HTTP. And the action that we want to have happen is to accept that traffic. And let's also go ahead and log it for good measure. And regarding installing it on, let's go ahead and install it just on firewall 1, because that's the only place this policy is going to be used anyway. So now with the NAT rules in place and the access control policy in place, let's go ahead and click on Publish. And we'll click on Install Policy. And then we'll click on Install to have it go. Now if there's a problem or an issue with our policy, it'll come up and tell us. Meanwhile, we'll let that cook. Let's go over to DCNUG. So DCNUG for this moment is going to be over here on the 10.3 network. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll send some traffic to the IP address of 67.83.0.111. And if the traffic is HTTP, TCP port 80, there should be a translation rule that translates the destination IP address over to the web server's address of 192.168.1.100. And because our access policy is also permitting that traffic, TCP port 80, to the outside IP address of the gateway, that should allow the actual packet to be forwarded over to that web server. At which case, if there's a web server running on this device, it should be able to reply back. And just for fun, let's verify the path also. I'm going to right click in the bottom left hand corner here on DCNUG. I'm going to right click on the Windows icon and then select the command prompt. And let's just do a quick path check here. Let's do a trace RT space -D. It says don't bother doing a DNS lookup for each of the hops. And let's go to 67.83.0.111. Press enter. I just want to verify the path is correct. And sure enough, the first hop is right here, firewall 2. And then the second hop goes directly to firewall 1. So let's go ahead and open up a browser. And if this if this works correctly, the browser that we bring up on this computer right here, which we're using DCNUG for this purpose, that traffic should go over to this IP address on TCP port 80 as a result of the port address translation that we set up, along with the access rules to allow it to happen. That packet should then be forwarded over to our web server, who should then go ahead and reply back to us. At which point firewall 1 has another translation rule for traffic sourced from the web server and then be forwarded back to PC2. So let's give it a shot. Let's bring up a browser. So we're going to click Chrome here in the taskbar. And let's go to 67.83.0.111. Cross our fingers and press enter. Survey says, wah, 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 wah. Let me close my browser. So let's try it one more time. I'm going to click on the Chrome icon, and one more time we'll do 67.83.0.111. Press enter. Yeah, that is not cooking. Well, we now enter the troubleshooting portion of our show. Let's go back and take a look at our translation rules and also our access rules. So going back to our client NUG computer, we can see down here that the policy installation happened, so that's good news. So let's take a look. So for NAT, let's go to NAT under access control. Traffic from anywhere going to the outside firewall IP address on TCP port 80, we want the translation to go to 192.168.1.100. That looks good. And for policy targets, that should be on firewall 1. And that might actually be the difference, because I actually have DCNUG sitting on both networks, and I have some very creative static routes that make this lab possible. So let's go ahead and apply that rule regarding this manual network address translation just on firewall 1, so that firewall 2 doesn't have to deal with it. And click on Publish. Then we'll click on Install Policy. Then we'll click on Install. And also in the lab, another option for troubleshooting this is we could also go to Logs and Monitor and take a look at where things went south. But I'm hoping that one change is going to make the difference. So our policy looks like it's going to complete. It did. Let's go back to DCNUG, and let's bring up Chrome on DCNUG, acting as the computer on the 10.3 network on the far right. And let's go to 67.83.0.111 and press enter. And the crowd goes mild. So the problem was that firewall 2 is also picking up on that rule, which really only applied to firewall 1. So when we made that correction, that then allowed it to work. So in this nugget, we had the opportunity to reinforce the concept of NAT, including using manual NAT rules in combination with access control policies to allow connectivity through the network. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.